Hey folks, we're just letting Zoom let people in real quick and then we'll get started. If you are already in Zoom here with us tonight, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to buy tonight's featured book. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're excited to welcome you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with Harvey Araton about his new book, Our Last Season, a writer, a fan, a friendship. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we get started, I just want to say a huge thank you to our hosts, Patrick and David, and tonight's featured author, Harvey, for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make the space for conversation and connection. And I have just a couple of housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There's a few different ways you can interact with our featured author and our hosts tonight that you'll see if you scroll over the bottom of your Zoom window. The first is the chat window, which is represented with one little speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with your fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Our Last Season, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day. And you can purchase Harvey's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store, or for shipping anywhere in the US. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our hosts for this evening are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of, and even some more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. David was an editor at Deadspin and is now a co-founder and co-owner at Defector.com. His writing has appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, Food and Wine, and The Baffler. They'll be speaking with featured author Harvey Araton. He is a longtime New York City sports journalist who worked for 25 years at the New York Times, to which he still contributes. He's the author or co-author of 7 books, most recently Driving Mr. Yogi, which was a New York Times bestseller. His book, When the Garden Was Eden, was made into an ESPN 30 for 30 documentary, which Harvey co-produced. In 2017, he was inducted into the media wing of Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. His new book, Our Last Season, is the moving story of a bond between sportswriter and fan that was forged in a shared love of basketball and grew over several decades into an extraordinary friendship. Chock-full of anecdotes from behind the scenes and cameos from Knicks legends, the story of Harvey and Michelle's friendship is a delight for basketball fans. But at its core, Our Last Season is a book for all of us, offering a poignant and inspiring message about how to live with passion, commitment, and optimism. Harvey is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Patrick and David and with all of you. Harvey, please take it away.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me. The excerpt that I'm going to read is the beginning of chapter 4 of the book. It's the title of the chapter is Courtship, and it kind of gives a little bit of a sense of how my friendship with Michelle Musler began many years ago at Madison Square Garden. If there is one time-honored truth in sports journalism, or journalism of any kind really, it's that nobody wants to talk to a nobody. Such was my predicament when Greg Gallo, my editor at the Post, walked over to my desk one summer morning in 1979 and told me to, quote, get Steinbrenner on the phone. At the time, I had virtually no name recognition outside Madison Square Garden, and far more than any basketball player, George Steinbrenner was the most sought-after sports figure in New York, while his two-time defending champion Yankees were the city's hottest story, in no small part because Steinbrenner was a walking, talking, back-page headline. On this day, word got around that his general manager, Al Rosen, was leaving the organization, which meant either that he'd been fired or that he couldn't take another day of being screamed at by the volcanic owner. On summer hiatus from my new Knicks beat responsibilities, I was working the day rewrite desk, cobbling together breaking news for the afternoon editions and, on occasion, covering for another beat reporter who was traveling or unreachable in the days long before cell phones. Get Steinbrenner on the phone. Sure, right away, no problem. I dialed the office he mainly worked out of in Tampa and was predictably stonewalled by his secretary, who had me on hold for minutes while Steinbrenner no doubt waved her out of the office at the mention of a name he'd never heard. What to do except admit failure. Far from secure on my beat and at the paper, I stalled for a while, keeping the phone in my ear before being inspired by a wave of desperation. I dialed Steinbrenner's office again and spoke quickly, authoritatively. I told the secretary, this is Mickey, I need George. Hold on, Mick, I'll get him. Mickey Morabito was the Yankees' lead PR guy, a job description that was shorthand for Steinbrenner's 24/7 personal press secretary and repository for letting off steam. Within seconds, Steinbrenner was on the line and I was hemming and hawing my way through an apologetic explanation of who I really was and why I had called. Inclined to slam down the phone, he couldn't help but give me a lecture, only to come around to the conclusion that he admired my audacity. Don't ever do this again. What do you need? I got my quote, a rather bland one for the bombastic boss, but I had done as I was told. I'd gotten Steinbrenner. The lesson was clear. Pathways to success didn't come easy to the new kid on the beat. I had to make the most of any opportunity I had. And at the Garden, a rather obvious one was Michelle. As charming as she was during our earliest conversations, my initial interest in her had much to do with the understanding that she was something of a Knicks insider, a potential source. When the Knicks relocated their bench directly in front of her, she even had a direct line to the team huddle. Whatever was going on there, I, as the Post beat reporter, the emergent Murdoch-subsidized muckraker, figured that she was likely to be privy to it. She had to know which players were ticked off when removed from a game, who had cursed at a teammate or two during a timeout, the poor souls in the crosshairs of the coaches, especially after the congenitally profane Hubie Brown had replaced Red Holzman the previous season and begun his reign of coaching terror. The early stages of our friendship thus were less a recognition of like-mindedness and more a process born of self-interest. Stopping by Michelle's seat before every game was strategic, even if I didn't have her undivided attention. I certainly had no arrangement of exclusivity. In fact, I had plenty of company. My enduring image of Michelle at courtside is with her tote bag of daily newspapers at her feet, a stream of pregame or halftime visitors wedged into the narrow area between her seat and the aisle behind the Knicks bench, and a security guard making a half-hearted attempt to keep traffic moving, but ultimately deferring to her and putting up with the logjam. They came from all walks of Garden life, employees, fellow fans, players' wives, girlfriends, and mothers varying from game to game, season to season, while neighboring fans watched in bewilderment. Bob Byrne, a real estate developer who for decades sat behind Michelle and whose wife Steffi initially mistook her for some high-powered Garden executive, summed up the scene perfectly when he once asked her, "Do you come here to watch the game or to take attendance?" But the most welcome visitors were the sports writers. Even an esteemed columnist like George Vesey of the Times, Peter Vesey's older brother, who dropped by the Garden mostly for the highest profile game, would make it his business to stroll over for a pregame chat about the latest political news, the weather, and of course, the state of the Knicks. As Vesey remembers it, Michelle was, quote, like a queen sitting there, but with the eyes and ears of a trained spy. Indeed, she was always watching closely, more than any of us really knew at the time, because Michelle, not unlike me, also had an agenda rooted in the fulfillment, at least abstractly, of her own adolescent sports journalism ambitions. Your job is my fantasy job, she would tell me years later. I live vicariously through you because I always wanted to be you. And that more or less sums up the origin of my relationship with Michelle. This woman, this very unusual woman who sat behind the Knicks bench for 45 years, starting from the season after they won their second and last championship, and eventually the relationship grew into something far more than source behind the bench, to something more like the wise elder and the wise family elder that I never really had growing up, and someone who became something of a career and life coach for me for most of my adult life.
Usually we run the video. We run a video before the Q&A, but I think we're going to run this one early because it's a trailer for the book. Anybody who's watching, I want to give you a sense of who she is, because the visuals, the pictures in this book are really bring the story out. I mean, so let's run the trailer for the book. You can get a sense of who she is in terms of her fandom and your friendship.
Call Michelle. For almost 4 decades, I'd been doing that. Reaching out to the steady voice of reason in my life. The proverbial wise elder. The trusted friend I always could count on. We all need one like Michelle Musler, whose instincts and insights and tough but dedicated love had guided me through so many professional and personal storms. In the parlance of basketball, the game we loved and shared, she was the coach who knew how to help me be the best version of myself.
What was the origin of your interest in basketball?
I went to a game. And I said, wow, I love this game. Today, when people ask me, why do you love this game? It's so simple. Games are never canceled because they're played indoors, so weather never affects them. You can see their facial expressions, watch their bodies do what they do, and that makes you know them better. And the game is never out of reach. If one team is 20 points ahead, that can be made up in a quarter. So, that doesn't happen in football, that doesn't happen in baseball. And so it was like I just loved the game.
It looks like this. Let me start by asking you when you thought this was. It's sort of a two-part memoir. It's your story of becoming a sports writer and your friendship and how that crossed over. I've read a couple of books I've been writing about memoirs and biographies for like more than a decade, and I was trying to think if I'd read a book like this. And most of the sports fans books I read are about the sort of the lunatics. There's a couple. I read one about a University of Alabama fan who rented a mobile home and sort of traveled with I think it's Warren St. John. Is that the right name?
Yeah, that's Rammer Jammer Yellow Hammer.
Exactly. And there's an Eagles one called If God Loves Philadelphia, Why Does He Hate the Eagles So Much? But it's all about, the face painters and the sort of diehards. And she's not that. She's a diehard basketball fan, but it is not about a person, the sort of craziness that you can get with fandom. And so I'm wondering when you thought this is a story that could be more, because it's more about a friendship than a fan, I guess is what I'm really trying to get at.
Yeah, in some respects, the the book has some of the earmarks of a book I did about 8 years ago called Driving Mr. Yogi, which was about the intergenerational friendship between Yogi Berra and Ron Guidry, two great Yankees who wound up, almost like family. It's a touching story about 14, 15 years that Guidry more or less took care of Yogi whenever he would show up in spring training as he aged and needed special care. So the book has some of that because this is an intergenerational friendship. It also has some elements of Tuesdays with Morrie, the Mitch Albom book from 20 years ago or so.
Way less saccharine, though. We should point out way less saccharine.
Not a comparison that either of us would make. You're welcome to do it.
Yes,
It was a
you're
very
right.
popular book.
I'm only saying that I would tend to agree with you, and I read it for the first time before I wrote this book. But I would say that the elements that are similar in that it is about life lessons and mentorship. Mm-hmm. And Michelle was certainly that in my life. And then there's something of this book I would say is a bit of a semi-sequel to When the Garden Was Eden, which is the book I wrote about the early 70s Knicks championship teams, their only championship teams in their history, because this book represents the years that came after those championship teams, or the years that I was around the Garden as a reporter and columnist for 3 or actually 4 different newspapers, including the Staten Island Advance, which was my first job. And so there are elements of all of that, all of those books in this one. But I think I would say that the first thought that I had, there had been times during our long friendship when Michelle would talk about her life, this very unusual backstory, a woman who was the high school sports editor of her high school newspaper, who dreamed of being a professional sports journalist, but it was the late 40s, early 50s, and there was no pathway into sports journalism for women back then. And so she went the more conventional route. She had 5 kids in less than a decade after she got married, following college graduation, and settled into a sort of semi-affluent suburban lifestyle until her marriage crashed and burned. Her husband left her with 5 young children and not much financial support. And not only—
Was he around? I want to ask real quick, was he around after that? I wasn't quite clear if he was—
He was sort of, he was an absentee father. He moved away. He remarried the woman he had an affair with in the neighborhood. They left Connecticut. He would sometimes have contact with his children, but there was some real hard financial times in those ensuing years. And this woman had to not only build a career, which she did in human resources, and finally developing her own company, which in effect was a corporate executive trainer, and traveled all over the world.
And was she ahead of her? Was she ahead of her time on that? I guess I wrote for business magazines, in the last 20 years, and life coaching seemed new in the early 2000s, but apparently not. Was she kind of a pioneer on that sort of executive hand-holding kind of thing?
I think she was probably a pioneer in terms of a woman doing that kind of work. But it wasn't until actually she developed her business, in the late 80s and 90s. I mean, she had climbed the corporate ladder. She had worked for Xerox and Pepsi and Time Warner, and then, struck out on her own. And companies like Procter & Gamble would hire her and send her to Jakarta, places like that, to deal with executives who were struggling with their employees or being abusive in some ways. And, she was basically the hired gun to go in and straighten the person out, as opposed to just, paying somebody off and letting them go and dealing with the public relations. So at the same time she was building her career so she could support her children, she also had to reconstruct her social life, her personal life. And she didn't really fit in that suburban lifestyle, which was mostly couples. And she found this place at the Garden, where she not only became a fixture at courtside, but she also assimilated, the sort of the back rooms of the little basketball universe there. She got to know all the players and their wives and the executives, and she hung out in the bar after the games with all these people. And that's where she recast, her social life, and developed a bunch of, people, women, mostly women like herself, who lived in Manhattan, who were single and had, high-powered careers, and they had a rotation of people who attended the games with her. And so, she kind of staked out a place there. And, I think that we had spoken. She would tell me her life story of things that she had dealt with when she was much younger. And I used to joke with her and say, Michelle, your life story is a book. And she would wave me off and laugh. But it wasn't really until after she had passed, and I had written her obituary in the Times and made a few calls to people, and their responses to the news that Michelle had passed really made an impression on me about the impact she had had at the Garden, and convinced me to consider doing the book.
That's something that I think is really very powerful in the book. It's not just, the relationship that you two had is not presented again in like kind of a, album-y or albumic, I don't know what the word would be there, but like you're not just like pouring gravy on top of it. Like you guys were clearly friends as adults for a long time, but there's something in it that is sort of is not really expressed, but that I think runs through the whole thing in terms of this book as being kind of a way of not just of celebrating her, but of grieving her. I mean, that you read, there's stuff in there from like, corporate training materials that she put together in the 80s that like you clearly went through a lot of her stuff more than just going over your own correspondence or whatever. How did this book help you not like process your own grief? 'Cause I don't need you to talk about that if you don't want to, but how did it change your understanding of your friend to consider her in this way?
Well, first of all, throughout the title of the book, Our Last Season, is sort of it sort of derives from that the basically that year, that season, 17-18 season, was really the first year that I was no longer covering or around the Garden on a regular basis. I left the Times staff in 2016. The first year or so that I had been gone from the staff, the editor I had worked most closely with was still there. And he just kind of treated it as if I had just gone from a staff reporter or columnist to a freelance reporter and columnist. And they kept assigning me to things. And of course, when you leave something you've done for many years, there's a transition that takes place. And it takes a while for many people you sort of let go in a more gradual way. And at the same time, the 2017-18 season was the first that Michelle could no longer attend games on any regular basis. She actually had her season tickets transferred to the man who had underwritten her for several years after she could no longer afford the tickets after they went from about $330 per seat per game to $900, pretty much overnight. And that was after the Garden had been renovated by James Dolan. So both of us were kind of going through, a significant change. And at the same time, her health had deteriorated. And so I spent a lot of time with Michelle that year, wanting to help her through this process as much as she was helping me through the process. So what happened is, we went, I'm sort of losing my train of thought here for a second. So you had asked specifically.
Basically about how the process of sort of reporting and researching the book, like did or didn't change the way you felt about the friendship and her.
So what you have to understand is that her health was deteriorating for, a good 10 months. But none of us had any inkling, including Michelle, that she had a terminal illness at the very end of her life when they discovered that she had lung cancer that had spread. So once that diagnosis was made, she passed away in like over the next 4 or 5 weeks. And so her death caught us all by surprise, and the sudden loss was really painful for me. So I think subconsciously wanting to do the book was an attempt to keep her close to me for a much longer period than I would have had it just been a normal, mourning period. And, even the recordings that you hear on that brief video come from conversations that I was recording during the last year of her life, with the idea that maybe we would do something together down the road, because I expected her to be living at least a few more years. But also I think to kind of remember all the things that we had shared and some of these discussions. But I'll tell you the one moment that I actually decided that I would really want to do a book. And that was when I called Jeff Van Gundy as I was reporting Michelle's obituary for the New York Times. And I said to him, we had chatted for a while about the NBA finals that had just concluded. And I said, Jeff, when you were coaching in New York, there was a woman who sat behind the bench, and he said, "You mean Michelle?" And, when I thought about that, and here's a guy who hadn't coached in New York in 17 years. He had gone on to coach the Houston Rockets, then become a national broadcaster. Probably had to remember thousands of people's names, or at least have a vague idea of who people he would meet, season by season. And yet at the mention of that woman behind the bench, Michelle's name was on the tip of his tongue. And it really struck home how much of an impact she had, how important she was to a lot of people there, myself among them, perhaps most important to me. And I was at that moment that, I had this epiphany that, I want to explore doing something that would be even a greater tribute to Michelle than the obituary in the Times.
I don't want to give too much away, but can you carry the Van Gundy story on to the next person you talk to who you wish you'd gotten the obituary? Because that's the best line in the whole book, comes from one Charles Oakley.
Yeah, well, after the Garden jacked up the ticket prices, the one thing they do offer, these for this price gouging is, they keep creating an exclusive club and a more exclusive club and an even more exclusive club. So they kind of create this caste system of super fans. And Michelle was in probably the second most elite club at the Garden. And often the former players would come through, whether it was Charles Smith or John Starks or, Walt Frazier. But Oakley, before he got into his little scuffle with the security people there and got tossed out, Oakley would often show up. And Michelle, he knew Michelle from the years he was playing. I mean, he was always a very chatty guy, unlike Patrick Ewing. And anyway, he knew Michelle, would often stop by her seat before a game when he was attending. And he used to always say to her, let's have lunch. And she would always thrill that he would think of asking her, but also knew that it would never come to pass. But he knew Michelle well, and he knew how many years she had been there. So when I called Oakley to talk to him for the book, he went on and on about Michelle and basically said, everybody makes a big deal about Spike Lee, but, Spike gets a chauffeured ride down from the Upper East Side. Michelle comes every night, year after year, from Stamford, Connecticut, an hour and a half each way, driving in traffic. And he said, Michelle he called her the Oak Man of Knick fans because she was like Oakley, who fancied himself as the, a foundational pillar of that franchise during the 90s. Michelle was the fan version of that, the Oak Man of Knick fans.
It's such a good, I mean, especially because it's like beyond it telling you how she was viewed, it's such a good Oakley moment too. It's like if like there's somebody that I liked and I'd be like, that guy is absolutely like the David Roth of deli counter employees. Like he's incredible. He shows up every day and he brings it. Like it's just the one bit that I wanted to talk about a little bit in terms of how the fans and the players interacted. I was fascinated as somebody who was a kid in New Jersey watching the Knicks teams of the 80s. I had walked by Charlie O's, which was like a steakhouse sort of bar type thing within Madison Square Garden. You described this like post-game demi-monde where there's like VIP types like Michelle, but then also executives, journalists, broadcasters, players coming through there. Like, can you just, to indulge me or indulge like the 9-year-old I used to be, what was the scene like at Charlie O's after Knicks games in like the 87-88 season?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that was a very different NBA than the one you have today.
Yes.
And there were far fewer barriers between all walks of Madison Square Garden life back then. So, when I tell some of my colleagues in the industry, who may not be all that much, younger than I am, 10 years, say, that, when I was on the Knicks beat for the Post and in the Daily News, we traveled on the team planes and on the team buses. And when we pulled into a city and we checked into a hotel, the keys and the rooming lists were spread out across the front desk. And just as the players were handed their room keys and a rooming list, so were we. So if I wanted to talk to Michael Ray Richardson or Bill Cartwright back in those days, or Bernard King, I didn't call an agent or even the PR guy. I just went and banged on his door. And if he didn't want to talk to me, he would say, not now. Or I could call him on the phone and say, hey, meet me in the coffee shop in 20 minutes. I need to talk to you. There was that kind of immediate access for us. So again, after a game, and for me, as in the early days when I was working for the New York Post in particular, it was an afternoon paper, which meant that the first edition of the Post didn't come out until, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. And so the edition might lock up at 4 or 5 in the morning, which means I had all night to write my story. So after the game, while my competitors were, in the media workroom pounding away on their, now I'm really going to date myself.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I'm waiting to hear laptop, but I know what's coming.
Yeah, at least for the first couple of years, till they invented the laptop. And even then, the laptop was about 30 pounds. While they were upstairs, writing for morning editions, I was down in the bar getting all of Michelle's little tidbits and tips that she had seen behind the bench and that she was picking up from the wives and the girlfriends. And sometimes for an individual player, it was the wife and the girlfriend. So, it was a scene. And, I'd go down there and, I'd turn around and there was Mark Jackson's agent, hey, what's going on? What's going on with that, with that contract extension? Yeah, we're talking about it. Give me a call tomorrow in the office and we'll talk some more about it. It was that kind of scene. And, like Butch Beard, who was in my very first couple of months on the beat, was a player. He got cut, came back a few weeks later when Red Holzman replaced Willis Reed as coach, as an assistant coach, and then he stayed on as a broadcaster. Butch was constantly down there in the bar, and I would say to him, what was going on, on the bench, when Red was yelling at whatever, and in a more relaxed setting, they'd had a post-game beer, they were hanging around in a loud environment, the guardrails would come down, and you would pick up a lot of stuff. Some of it, they would say, I don't want to see that in the paper, but at least I knew a lot of stuff that was going on behind the scenes, and that helped me, go in the right direction for the stories that I was writing. So, it all goes back to a very different kind of NBA which was not even close to approaching the kind of global phenomenon that it is today. And that made for a much more relaxed work environment for people like myself.
Also bridged, I mean, the NBA it's not Major League Baseball, so I guess the timing is a little different, but you must have had coworkers who went back to the days of reporters and athletes just getting, shit-faced at Toots Shores or whatever. Like there was, like, by the time you started, there was sort of journalistic rules, right? That were a little bit different than that had been when players and, reporters just drank all the time. So you were kind of bridging two eras in some way, right? Was that still when you started, was it sort of, it felt to me like the book, there was clearly like agents working an angle and players working somewhat of an angle. The money wasn't the same. And, the sort of protecting your brand wasn't the same, but they also weren't sort of the old days where it's like, well, you're not going to write about what I'm doing anyway, so what do I care?
No, it wasn't that at all. There was a real sense that, we were, if not the enemy, that we were, often the opponents. But there was also this understanding that they needed us long before there was, an NBA.com and an NBA TV. And, the mentality developed that, they could control their own message if they needed to. And remember, I also started on the beat for the Post. And, I think this was 1978. It was only 2 years after Rupert Murdoch bought the paper and turned it from what was considered to be a well-written, left-leaning, but somewhat sleepy afternoon tabloid to a sensational, grab the reader by the collar as they're walking past the newsstand, scandal sheet. So, as the Post beat reporter, that was something that I had to deal with in addition to, the understanding that, no, we were no longer there to just promote them. That era had ended. There were a couple of older guys who were still sort of, fill-ins on the beat. Their careers were coming to an end. But there was one guy in particular who worked in New Jersey at one of the Jersey papers who actually would come around and he would wear he had a championship ring that he wore from the 1970 season, the 1970 championship. And so, back in there were days, in the 50s and 60s when the NBA, when the individual teams would actually pay for the beat writers to travel with them so that they would get daily reports in the major newspapers. That had all ended. I mean, we were clearly there as journalists by the time I came around. But again, because the league, remember, 1978 was 6 years before David Stern became commissioner. So things like the salary cap, the drug plan that they ballyhooed, when they did their major collective bargaining agreement in the 80s, all of those things had not happened. And, the vision that Stern brought to the league, that it could be, it could be something much greater because they had highly visible and attractive athletes to market. None of that apparatus was in place yet. So the fact is, as I mentioned, they needed the print media guys, and of course, 1978 was only 1 year before the founding of ESPN. So it was a completely different media world as well.
There's something about what you were talking about in terms of the way that it had been somewhat more open, or at least, as adversarial as it was, that there was still a sense of accessibility outside of the way that it is now, where it's very sort of regimented. And to me, one of the, you can't really talk about that with the Knicks without talking about Dolan and sort of not that he, was a sort of a pioneer in the field of being a jerk. Like, people had gotten there before him on that one, but the sort of the chill in the room at the Garden is very much the chapter that you have on him and Michelle's sort of relationship on him is called Dolan and the Death of Hope, which does kind of tell you a little bit about the general vibe of that chapter. But I was really struck by this. I think of all the things that were sort of there for her, to sort of learn about her. She really tried to give that guy the benefit of the doubt. Like there's something kind of startling about like that is a generous spirit to do that sort of thing.
Well, Michelle, as a sports fan, or the Knicks fan, NBA fan, was not it. She never booed. She never joined in the chorus, when the team was playing badly.
Except for apparently we should mention Carmelo.
Right.
She clearly had,
He had that effect
clearly
on
had
people.
Carmelo problems.
She didn't. I think I used to try to convince her that Carmelo was a pretty good guy. I mean, I wasn't his biggest fan as a player either, but I think she more resented Carmelo because he represented the Dolan interference. So, consider the fact that what Michelle did for a living was fix, misbehaving or broken corporate executives like Jim Dolan, who have problems relating to people. And it wasn't that it was never a personal thing with her, but she sat there behind the bench. And of course, Dolan's seat on the baseline was, right near where Michelle sat. I mean, it was, a bounce pass or two away. And so she observed him, throughout the, this century, slumped in his seat, the worst possible body, posture that you could imagine. And she would sit there and fantasize as the years went on and the team, just didn't improve. She fantasized what it would be like to work with him if she could take him on as a client. She even, at one point, considered calling David Stern, who was someone she knew, and asking, please intervene. Let me work with Jim Dolan and try to make him a better executive. So that chapter, and I didn't really want to, the book is very much a relational book, and I didn't really want to impose too much hardcore basketball into it and, make it difficult for the non-basketball fan to get through. But you can't write a book about, a Knicks fan at Madison Square Garden, encompassing the last 20 years or 18 years, and not write about Jim Dolan. Yeah. So, his dysfunctional organization essentially destroyed the final years of Michelle's, being around the Garden, and she, grew to resent that. And so, we included that chapter, and it's really her dissection of him, not as a human being by any stretch, but as an executive, based on what she observed and what she read and what she knew.
Yeah, there's some fascinating stuff in there about her just kind of diagnosing him from afar, not as like, I mean, to a certain extent in the way that everybody that observes James Dolan and it's just kind of like something's not cooking right there. Like maybe it's his dad, maybe he wants, X, Y, or Z. Maybe it's like, but
she has could be the pork pie hat.
Could be the hat, could be the guitar solos, could be the lyrics. But there's a great bit in there where she talks about him like getting heckled and like sort of just like being rude to people and calling them assholes and everything. And she was like, I'd give him some flashcards and they'd have sentences on it. And they would say like, we're going to bring you a winner. But it was like, it's not, I mean, like as an owner, he tries, he just can't get out of his own way, but like he spends money. It's not like a Will Pond sort of situation, but her being able to see him as not just as like a curdled person, but as like a failed leader was actually like a really unique perspective that I don't think that I had seen. And Lord knows I've read enough about what a turd that guy is over the course of my life.
I think she was trying to figure out just what it is. She understood that this is a guy, this is something in New York that we've seen, several times. The sons of, very successful businessmen who wind up buying a sports team, whether it's the Wilpons or the Steinbrenners or the Maras. And the sons, are handed something. It's not something they built on their own. And there's a lot of pressure, expectation, and a sense of, that people are watching. Also, I thought the great observation she made was that she compared the Dolan that she saw at the Garden, again, slumped in his seat, the bad body language that she contended really filtered down through the organization, and she compared it to, the sort of the vibrant, impassioned persona of someone like Mark Cuban, in Dallas. And she said what struck her was when she would see video of Dolan in his blues band, his rock band, on stage and rocking his fedora, and she said that he seemed much more confident and comfortable on the stage, and she thought that essentially had a lot to do with the fact that that's something he created by himself or for himself, and therefore took much greater pride and had much greater self-esteem. And she said she just felt, some ways she felt sorry for him, that he was just so ill-suited to take this very public position as the owner of a basketball team that it really, win or lose, has for decades been the apple of New York's eye. I mean, I've always contended that the Knicks, more than any other sports franchise in the New York area, can unite the city, because now that might change because of the Brooklyn Nets and obviously with Durant and Kyrie Irving and all of that. But for most of these years,
I haven't seen it. I mean,
yeah, I think at
I
this
live
point
a few
it's fair to
blocks from
say.
I live 5 blocks from the Barclays Center, and I still think I know one actual Mets fan, like real Mets fan.
It'll be curious to see if they're the real deal, but for most of the time that Michelle was at the Garden, and myself as well, the Nets were out on Long Island in the ABA, and then they went to New Jersey and nobody cared about them.
Sorry, what's that? What?
Hold on. But
you got one person that did in here, man.
One crazy thing in the book, though, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. She also went to Mets games.
Yeah.
She went to the Brendan Byrne, whatever that was. She would go on the off nights. That to me is crazier.
I mean, I did too, but my dad drove me. That was one where I have it underlined in the book, and I just wrote pervert behavior. It's like in a way that I admire, but that is like when you really need your fix and you drive to East Rutherford.
That's when her kids got a little older. They were either in high school and college, actually all in college or beyond. And she had moved into Manhattan. She had an apartment that she had in the city. And then she had her home in Stanford. And because she was in the city all the time, and again, the NBA was the majority of her social world. And she was able, I think, my gut feeling is that she probably got comped on her Nets tickets because they were so desperate to get anybody in the building. But she not only loved the Knicks, she loved the NBA, she loved the athletes. And so it was another opportunity to see Dr. J or Larry Bird or Magic come in, or Michael, on top of the games that she attended at the Garden.
Can I ask you, she's your friend, and I don't want to diagnose things. I hate the word surrogate family, but when you read the relationship with her children, it's not unusual to live apart from your children. I don't live anywhere near where my parents are, but it's weird to not see them for years at a time. Like, she has a daughter in Florida that she didn't see. And I hate the word surrogate family because that feels like the idea is that she knew, I'm going to be around you and not think about my family. But I'm just wondering about the amount of time she invested in basketball as unintentional distraction. I don't know. It just seems like, I'm not asking you to tell me how close she was to her family, but they had some issues because they're all spread apart and not seeing each other that often. Did the amount of time she put towards the Knicks and the league, and was it somewhat of a distraction? I mean, was there something there to not have to think about the reality of her own family, especially after putting in all those years of hard work dealing with type A white male assholes, the same probably guy who left her? She found a place in this world that didn't take the place of her family. That's ridiculous, but did take up a lot of time in which she didn't have to, where she felt safe, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I think, in the book where we used that 17-18 season as the vehicle to explore the friendship and also her life, but also as, during that year and as her health deteriorated, she, did a lot of reflection. A lot of reflecting. And, I think she did have some regrets. There was no question about the time away from home, not only at the Garden, but she also traveled for her work. And as her kids got, high school years where they were a little more independent. But I think, it's complicated. I think, definitely, the hardship they went through, because the years after their dad left, there was a lot of financial hardship before she really developed her career. And her kids, I think there are always going to be some scars that are left in adulthood from that very unconventional kind of family life. But by the same token, because their dad had left, because Michelle, as a teenager in high school, had tuberculosis and there was some fears for her life. I think she was a junior in high school. Because so many things had happened to her, the poverty that she had to deal with, she was, and she says it in the book, that she was determined to make sure her children were independent and could take care of themselves. And I think that's how she, in her positive frame of mind, I think that's how she viewed it, that whatever the sacrifices were in terms of her time around the children, that she was content, for the most part, that they grew up to be self-sustaining, independent people. The family did, I attended a lot of, through the years, Christmas Eve dinners. She used to throw one every Christmas Eve. And after a certain point, I was always invited. And when I got married, it was with my wife and then with my first young son. So her kids were around for the most part, for most of these years on holidays. One of her daughters would fly in every year from California to attend the US Open with her. Her oldest child, her son, lived in New York, so she saw him plenty of times. She was fairly close, with her 3 grandchildren, one of whom lived in the city. The other 2 lived in the Boston area, so they would come down. So it wasn't what I would call a dysfunctional or splintered family. It's just that as the years went on, and one was living in Florida, 2 were in California, one was in Boston, and the other one was in New York, they were spread out, and it just became more difficult to just hop on a plane and fly in, and we're leading busy lives. And I think that's just the way the family functioned.
Did you think the Knicks, because she was not, clearly was not the sort of X's and O's, like this was not some kind of Aspergery basketball thing. She liked being around the team. Do you think that did, if fill a void is not the right word, do you just think it took up a lot of time? I mean, I can't imagine I go to like 10 games a year across all sports, and that seems like more than enough. I just can't imagine going in and night out. Did it become, a way to kind of become her, you talk about her social life, did it become her main sort of thing once the kids were kind of out of the house? And
yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the fans I've spoken to, around especially around courtside, those are the people with the season tickets, and they tend to show up to most games. I mean, it's a little different now because a lot of those, old season ticket holders got priced out like Michelle did. And so essentially they renew their season tickets to keep them in case they get good again, and they might go to some games. But for the most part, they sell off most of their tickets on the ticket exchange, and sometimes they make a small profit on those games. So, but a lot of them through the years, the ones I would speak to who knew Michelle, or just people I knew from being around courtside myself, spoke of it like, that it was a neighborhood, like it was their family. They were, and again, I think, the view of it now for the last 10, 15 years is very different. In the 90s, you know, if you were a fan of the team, you really wanted to be there every night because every night was sort of a show. There was a contending team. It was not an attractive team in the sense that they had a Michael Jordan type player, but they had sort of the Joe Frazier of NBA contenders, someone who was a compelling figure because he could knock you out at any moment.
Well,
And of course,
especially
Riley was the star of those teams in the early 90s. And then Van Gundy in his own right, you know, Riley was the perfect man and Van Gundy was the everyman. In some ways, he was just as appealing because of who he was. So I think, you know, Michelle went, yes, but it was also part of her. It was the major part of her social life at that point in time. She had many friends, and it wasn't just the people in the section. It was the people like Mike Breen who would stop by to say hello before every game, or the trainer, or Walt Frazier. I mean, she knew all these people. She was part of that whole scene.
There's one little bit, I know we're running low on time, so I won't, hopefully I'll just get straight to it. You mentioned a couple of times in the book that she was not just, you know, a supporter of you professionally, but that also like had herself wanted to, and maybe, you know, had she been born in a different era, might have been a sports writer herself. And there's little bits of her writing featured in the book, usually from her Christmas cards, the letter that she would sort of enclose with it. And she's a fantastic writer, like a super lively, funny stylist. Yeah. Like, did you get to read? I mean, I know she never really wrote about basketball and stuff like that, but did you get to read more of her writing, you know, like stuff that you maybe hadn't seen because of the relationship that you had with her when you were putting the book together?
Well, she used to give me samples of her business writing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, her brochures, her letters. She would always send me the letters. She was an incorrigible letter writer. I mentioned in the book that she would dash off a letter at the drop of a hat. You know, something would strike her. One day she was watching the sports reporters on ESPN, and it hit her that there was no diversity on the panel. And so she dashed off a letter to the producer of the sports reporters and complained about that. When the Knicks first created the City Dancer, she was offended by that. So she dashed off a letter to Dave Checketts. And all of these were written in a very entertaining, sarcastic way. I also was on the mailing list for her family, you know, holiday newsletters, and they would come year after year. I didn't save them, so when I started working on the book, I asked one of her daughters if anybody still had the newsletters, and lo and behold, she found, you know, a whole bunch of them, and she sent them to me. And yes, she was a terrific writer with a great sense of humor. And there's no doubt in my mind, given her love for sports and her natural ability to not just write, but also communicate with people, that she would have made a great reporter.
Let me ask you one more question. Then we have to wrap up, unfortunately. I am mid-Gen X. I'll be 50 next year. And I was thinking about this reading your book. I have probably one close female friend, confidant, a couple others that are sort of separate from, you know, our couple friendship sort of thing with my wife. Did it ever, how did that strike you? Did you ever think about that? I mean, you know, going back to male-female friendships, hopefully they're more common than they were, but they've not been, you know, at least in my lifetime, it was always maybe you're friends with your wife and your friends, but just having a female confidant, did that strike you? Did it ever occur to you like this is unique? Was it unique?
Well, I've always had a lot of female friends. In fact, my girlfriend from high school in my first year or two of college is a close friend of mine now, and I'm good friends with her husband. And my wife also happens to have several old male friends from growing up in Connecticut and college. And so I think that, kind of buffer, served as a bit of a buffer in just with that potential issue. The fact that Michelle was, 17, 18 years older than I am also, I think that if there was one issue that I felt a little uncomfortable with at first, it was that whenever I was in Greenwich, Connecticut, visiting my in-laws with my family, my children, that I always felt that I wanted to go and make time and see Michelle, who lived essentially 2 exits away on the Merritt Parkway. And because of this unusually close friendship. And I think at first I was a little concerned about how my in-laws and my wife would deal with that, well, you came to visit us and where the heck is Harvey? He's often with this woman, but I think my wife understood that there was no relationship in my own family that I had that was sort of like the one I had with Michelle. And, my parents love me and I have 2 sisters but I grew up in public housing in a working blue collar family. And there was nobody in my family who really understood the work that I do and had a great interest in sports. And so I think my wife understood that Michelle was filling a vacuum that I had dealt with for my entire life until I met her, or, for the years before I met Michelle. And so she was always very accepting of my friendship with Michelle. And I think she made it clear to her family that when it came to Michelle, she was family for me. And then as the years went by, Michelle was invited to my in-laws' holiday dinners, and we were always at her house, and we knew her children. So if there was any discomfort early on, it was not so much about me having a close female friend, but more, someone whose time, the time I spent with her took away from family time with Beth's parents and her siblings.
I still think it's unique, the relationship that you have. It comes through in the book, and separate that men and women can't be friends. Of course, that's insane, no matter what the Harry Met Sally thing was. But the relationship you 2 had was really unique. And, the book just captures something I don't think I've ever read in a book. A friendship like that, also courtside. It's like a great friendship with the courtside Knicks stories also in it.
Yeah, let me just say that if there was anything unusual about the friendship, it was the age differential. I think more likely male-female friends, far less likely friendship of this nature with someone who is from a completely different generation. Mm-hmm. And I always was careful to not characterize it as like surrogate parent, because at that I would have been really loath to do that because of my respect for her relationship with her own children. Yeah. And I was always mindful of the fact that when I did the book with Guidry and Yogi, Guidry was always cautioning me as we were doing the book, please don't portray Yogi as a father figure. I have a father and I only need one. Yogi is my friend. And that was something I kept in mind these last bunch of years, when I would speak about Michelle.
Well, and I don't know what you think, Dave. We got to wrap up, but maybe there should be more books and just writing about friendship, period. Like you don't read that much about it.
Man, it's such a strange oversight too. I had that thought. In terms of writing about grief, writing about people you care about, like there are ways to do it that are less, like skyrockets in flight, like show-offy literary stuff. Like this is just a very clean, honest way of talking about caring about somebody. And I really enjoyed reading it. I think that's excellent.
Thank you.
Two adults who care about Eddie Lee Wilkins and each other. You can't beat it.
Two adults.
And don't forget Ron Pavanel, who brought to dinner.
Yeah, I like that bit.
We didn't even get into Bernard King, who always gets short shrift. So the book right here. It's a
It's
wonderful
nice.
book.
You'll like it.
And it's warm and but not saccharine. Tuesdays with Maury. It's very warm and it's a great story about a friendship, a unique friendship. And you also get to relive nice Knicks memories if you're a Knicks fan. One more thing, this book, our next Squawkin Sports, which will be 11/19, Answers in the Form of Questions by Claire McNeil, which is a history of Jeopardy. And she spent a lot of time talking to Alex Trebek, and now this book has taken on a whole different meaning. But it's really good, and
When's that, in a week?
a week from Thursday.
I'll get an email.
For
I don't know.
Thanksgiving.
Don't worry about it.
But we're doing a lot of post-mortem stuff. That was our first Hall of Famer. So Harvey, you were our first Hall of Famer. Thank you for
Seriously.
coming on.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea.
And, be well.
Yeah, thank you all for the wonderful conversation. If anyone missed any part of it or just wants a rewatch, reminder that it will be up on our YouTube channel, Greenlight Bookstore, within the next couple of days. You can buy Harvey's book or Claire's book for the upcoming Squawkin Sports at Greenlight, noon to 7 in-store shopping, or 24/7 for online shopping at Greenlight Bookstore. Have a great rest of your evening, everyone, and thanks so much again.
Thanks.
Night,
Bye.
everyone.